Imagine looking in the mirror, watching yourself breathe, speak, move, and yet feeling like none of it actually belongs to you. For countless people, this isn't a sci-fi glitch but an unsettling part of lived reality. Recent reviews show that brief episodes of depersonalization or derealization are extremely common, ranking just after anxiety and low mood. But for about 1% of the population, these sensations persist and develop into a clinical disorder. So why would the brain make the world feel unreal in the first place? Is it a survival trick that overshoots, or something else entirely? So how common is this glitch, really? When most people first hear about depersonalization or derealization, they assume it must be rare, something unusual you'd only read about in a clinical manual. But research shows that this glitch-like sensation is much more common than expected, both in fleeting moments and in persistent forms that count as a full disorder. The clearest way to understand it is to separate two different questions. First, how many people ever feel brief detachment from themselves or their surroundings? Second, how many live with a lasting version that disrupts daily life? Studies suggest that transient depersonalization and derealization have lifetime rates anywhere from about 26% to as high as 74%. In other words, most people will encounter at least one passing episode under stress, exhaustion, or heightened emotion. By contrast, depersonalization-derealization disorder, the clinical condition where those feelings recur and interfere with functioning, appears at around 1% in the general population, with different studies ranging roughly between 0.8% and 1.9%. That gap between fleeting episodes and the full diagnosis is essential. Ordinary lapses in focus, like forgetting part of a walk home or zoning out during a lecture, come and go without making you doubt reality itself. But depersonalization and derealization symptoms sit further along the same spectrum. When they persist, people may feel that their reflection in a mirror doesn't belong to them, or that the room around them looks staged or artificial. The brain fails to reset, leaving those distortions stuck on repeat. Here's a quick way to check the difference for yourself. Have you ever felt detached from your body or surroundings during intense stress? Most people would answer yes, but do those feelings return again and again, lasting long enough to interfere with your life? If the answer there is also yes, that's where the line into disorder becomes relevant. Researchers have also found important demographic patterns. Adolescents and young adults tend to report higher rates of symptoms, with surveys of students showing that 11–12% describe significant depersonalization or derealization experiences. Women and men appear equally likely to meet criteria, suggesting this isn't a gender-skewed phenomenon, but a shared vulnerability across populations. Thinking about prevalence this way dissolves the myth that dissociation lives only at the margins. When a symptom appears in surveys across dozens of cultures, at rates surpassing many other recognized conditions, it's not obscure, it's mainstream. For the majority, episodes fade quickly. But for the millions worldwide who struggle with persistent symptoms, this isn't a momentary oddity, but a lasting alteration to the way consciousness feels. These numbers also matter because they shape how the public frames mental health. If detachment was seen as an exotic disorder, few people would feel comfortable admitting to it. Instead, recognizing that brief episodes happen to a large part of the population shows that the capacity for these distortions is built into normal brain function. It doesn't mean something is broken when you experience them. It means the mind is drawing on a mechanism nearly everyone carries, though for a minority it turns from fleeting to entrenched. That framing also helps clinicians. For too long, depersonalization-derealization disorder has hovered in a gray zone, too common to ignore yet often dismissed as so rare that doctors don't screen for it. Updated prevalence ranges suggest otherwise. Psychologists now describe it as the third most frequently reported symptom cluster, after anxiety and depressed mood. Even if only about 1% qualify for a clinical diagnosis, that still reflects a burden comparable to several better recognized psychiatric conditions. Ignoring it risks mislabeling patients, delaying treatment, or leaving people confused about why their symptoms don't fit categories like panic disorder or psychosis. It's useful to picture the phenomenon on a spectrum. On one end are familiar slips of attention, brief zoning out episodes that nearly everyone knows. In the middle stretch are more intense spells of feeling unreal that still resolve quickly in most people. And at the far end are individuals whose brains seem caught in the pattern, with depersonalization or derealization intruding for long stretches every day. Viewing it as a gradient highlights continuity rather than a sharp divide, and may help people who struggle see that they are far from isolated in the experience. This recognition also has practical consequences for treatment. When health systems acknowledge that persistent depersonalization or derealization is not rare, they adapt accordingly. Clinicians become more confident in asking about it. Intake questionnaires start to include direct questions about feelings of unreality. And professionals in primary care, who sometimes mistake the symptoms for psychosis or substance effects, learn to identify it as a distinct profile that requires its own approach. Patients benefit when their experiences are contextualized instead of dismissed. Beyond numbers, prevalence reframing reshapes how people understand their own glitch-like moments. Instead of seeing them as unexplainable, they can recognize them as a well-documented part of human psychology, lying on a continuum from everyday detachment to clinical disorder. Realizing how crowded that spectrum is interrupts the stigma of rarity. You are not the only person feeling estranged from your own voice, your reflection, or your environment. Millions of others report it too, whether only in passing or as a major feature of their mental health journey. All of this naturally leaves one question lingering. If temporary or lasting estrangement from self and surroundings is so widespread, what is the brain actually doing during those episodes? And why would a system designed to keep us grounded in reality sometimes mute or distort that very sense of reality? What the brain is actually doing during these episodes? Why would a protective brain nudge you away from feeling fully inside your own body or environment? The surprising answer lies not in damage, but in how the brain regulates threat. On the surface, this seems paradoxical. A core role of the nervous system is to take in sensory input and produce a seamless sense of reality. Yet in depersonalization and derealization episodes, that integration falters. Instead of firming the boundary between self and world, the system blurs it. Instead of attaching familiar emotional weight to experience, it strips it away. At first, this looks like malfunction, but evidence suggests it is more like a defensive recalibration. The brain normally stitches sensory signals into a unified picture that feels both accurate and personally owned. You look at a tree, and the input is not just raw shape or color. It has texture, distance, and familiarity layered in, yielding a secure sense of this is a tree in my world. When episodes occur, that certainty slips. Research using neuroimaging shows that connections between sensory processing areas and higher-order integration hubs weaken. In those moments, the data still reaches the brain, but the usual step of tagging it with belonging and meaning does not complete. In practical terms, the information is there but feels hollow. People describe it like watching a vivid movie where the soundtrack has been muted. The content plays fine, but the emotional channel that makes it real has been stripped out. That hollowing out effect shows up in imaging scans as reduced communication between regions that normally bind perception with emotion. One reliable pattern across recent studies anchors these findings. Increased activity in prefrontal executive areas combined with reduced activity in limbic emotional circuits. This prefrontal hyperactivation, limbic hypoactivation profile has been described in multiple reviews. It suggests that rather than shutting down, the brain doubles down on control in one area while dampening another. The result is a lopsided state, heightened self-monitoring with underpowered emotional coloring. Certain brain regions appear repeatedly in this research. The ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, known for supervising responses, the temporoparietal junction, which helps tie together perspectives of body and space, the insula, a center for internal bodily awareness, and the precuneus, tied to self-imagery, all show disrupted function or connectivity during depersonalization-derealization episodes. The specific mix may vary by person, but the overall theme holds. Brain nodes that map the self and its environment stop integrating in the usual way. Why would the nervous system adopt this stance? Stress and trauma provide the functional clue. In overwhelming situations, severe fear, emotional overload, exhaustion, the brain sometimes chooses detachment to limit impact. The analogy often used is a circuit breaker. Power doesn't fail by accident, it is deliberately tripped to prevent worse damage. In dissociation, sensory input continues, but the connective emotional circuits go offline to reduce risk of panic or collapse. This protective hypothesis explains familiar subjective effects. The sense of a glass wall between yourself and the world lines up with perception remaining intact, but emotional resonance stripped. Feeling like words or movements do not belong to you reflects motor signals traveling normally, but without integration into ownership networks. What looks like a nervous system breaking is more like one deploying emergency safety features. The catch is that the strategy can become overactive, persisting far beyond its usefulness. These shifts also unfold over longer timescales than many people expect. Seizures or stroke changes show as sudden, dramatic spikes or losses of activity. By contrast, depersonalization and derealization appear in scans as sustained misalignments. Certain pathways stay quieter than usual, while executive circuits maintain unusual levels of activity. That persistence explains why some episodes drag on for days or weeks. The brain has locked into what it senses as the safest mode, and the harder a person panics about the sensations, the more the prefrontal systems clamp down. This also clarifies why grounding strategies have a chance to work. When the brain is withholding integration, it effectively waits for signs that it can release protective control. Strong sensory experiences, sharp cold, identifiable sounds, or describing detail in the environment provide direct evidence that no present danger exists. These inputs press on the same systems that have been muted, giving the brain reasons to turn off its cautionary stance. Over time, repeated reassurance reactivates the circuits that reconnect sensory data with belonging. Reframing dissociation as a safety function, not a defect, has more than academic value. Many people experiencing these episodes jump to catastrophic conclusions, that their minds are breaking or reality itself cannot be trusted. But identifying dissociation as a crude protection device redirects interpretation. The pain of the symptom remains, but the meaning changes. It is not evidence of collapse, it is proof of a nervous system overshooting its job to preserve functioning. That distinction provides hope rather than fear. Clinicians who explain it this way often see relief in patients. Instead of being trapped in cycles of fearing insanity, individuals can understand that an overvigilant protector is in play. The metaphor is less about broken wiring and more about a seatbelt locked too tightly around the body, designed to help in emergencies, but uncomfortable and restrictive when stuck. Recognizing overuse allows better strategies for loosening that hold. Looking across the findings, the overall image grows consistent. Depersonalization and derealization feel extreme and destabilizing, yet their neurological footprint matches a survival tactic. Increased executive control, reduced emotional resonance, and dropped integration across body and world maps combine into a defensive mode. It keeps a person functional when the system anticipates overwhelm, though at a heavy cost to groundedness. That reframe doesn't erase the suffering. Feeling split from yourself or cut off from your surroundings is draining, often frightening, and sometimes persistent. But knowing that the pattern is not random chaos makes a difference. It returns coherence to an experience that otherwise feels inexplicable. At its core, dissociation is the nervous system's attempt to hold the line under pressure, even if it ends up misfiring in everyday life. And once you understand what the brain is doing mechanically, another question comes forward. Does the altered state affect how you disconnect from yourself versus how you disconnect from the outside world? Depersonalization versus derealization, spotting the difference. Have you ever tried to sort out whether the disconnection feels like it's coming from inside you or from the world outside? That's the practical difference between depersonalization and derealization. They both sit under the same diagnostic umbrella, but each highlights a slightly different kind of unreal. Depersonalization describes the self feeling disconnected. Derealization describes the environment feeling altered or staged. Clinicians often see both symptoms occur together, and the DSM groups them into a single disorder only when they persist long enough to cause distress and disruption. Still, distinguishing them can give you useful language for describing just what part of reality seems to have slipped. Depersonalization is about detachment from your own experience. You go through motions, walking, talking, brushing your teeth, but it feels like your body is on borrowed time, like you're observing from a step back rather than inhabiting yourself. Thoughts, movements, even your voice can feel oddly foreign, as if they belong to someone else. People often compare this to running on autopilot or playing a video game character that moves correctly but never feels fused with you. The core thread is that me doesn't quite reach its usual sense of ownership. Derealization flips the focus outward. The world itself appears intact but oddly artificial, as if wrapped in a pane of glass. You notice sharp details, streetlights, faces, buildings, but the sense of depth or authenticity drops away. Some describe it as standing inside a movie set where everything is visually normal yet emotionally flat. You can touch objects, but your connection to them isn't convincing, as though the coffee cup in your hand belongs to a simulation. The environment feels stage-like rather than lived in. Both of these modes can overlap during the same episode. You might feel detached from your inner voice while your room simultaneously looks dreamlike. But a rough dividing question can cut through the confusion. Does it feel like I don't feel real, or does it feel like the world doesn't feel real? That phrasing offers a quick tool for self-checking when symptoms blur. Certain metaphors sharpen the difference. Depersonalization, floating above your body, lagging behind your movements, or viewing life through a fogged windshield. Derealization, seeing familiar places as cardboard cutouts, sensing reality filtered through glass or moving through a dreamlike fog. Condensed to their simplest form, one is I don't feel real, the other is this place doesn't feel real. Those short, punchy images capture the contrast more clearly than long lists. Memory offers another quiet clue. In depersonalization, your own experiences may feel oddly unanchored. Events happened, but they don't feel stored as genuinely yours. In derealization, the problem tilts outward. your recall of the world has a muted, dreamlike quality, as if memories pass through a haze filter. Nothing is lost, but the texture of remembering feels skewed. Knowing this distinction sometimes helps people label odd memory complaints that otherwise seem hard to pin down. The emotional fallout differs too. When self-detachment dominates, panic often turns inward, fears of losing identity, disappearing, or going insane. With world detachment, anxiety shifts outward, worries that the universe is broken, that nothing will ever feel real again. Neither set of worries means the experience is permanent, but spotting which side you're on allows coping strategies to fit better. For self-detachment, focusing on bodily sensation, breath, touch, movement, tends to ground you back. For world detachment, emphasizing constancy in your surroundings, naming objects, checking context, can steady you. Clinicians emphasize that most people don't experience clean categories. Human minds are messy, and depersonalization and derealization mingle easily. Instead of expecting textbook boundaries, it helps to treat these terms as tools for mapping the texture of your symptoms. They offer language where otherwise there might just be confusion, and language alone can sometimes ease fear. So the practical takeaway is straightforward. When unreality strikes, ask yourself one quick question: am I questioning me or the world? That brief self-assessment can cut through panic, anchor your description, and give you a starting point for what to do next. And recognizing that both forms often travel together reminds you that none of this is beyond understanding. It's simply part of how the brain copes under strain. And that raises another complication. If inner and outer disconnection are already hard to separate, what happens when daily life itself adds extra layers of unreality? Our environments today challenge the brain in new ways, blending physical and virtual experiences until the boundary between them can feel blurred. Why digital life makes this worse? Here's something modern life has introduced that older generations never faced: long stretches of time where our senses and attention are drawn almost entirely into a screen. That immersion doesn't create dissociation from scratch, but it can make certain people more likely to feel detached afterward. Think about doom scrolling. You open your phone for a few updates, and half an hour later you're still swiping. The feed trains your attention to move fast, jumping from text to photos to video without pause. When you finally put the screen down, your body and environment can feel strangely muted by comparison. It's like stepping out of a loud, brightly lit arcade into a quiet street. That sharp shift in stimulation is brief, but for someone already prone to dissociative symptoms, the unreal sensation can stick. If that resonates with you, one practical step is to track whether long scroll sessions tend to come just before your own episodes. Virtual reality amplifies this further. Headsets are designed to trick the brain into treating a false environment as if it were real. They adjust vision, sound, even motion cues until presence feels convincing. And research backs this up. VR studies show that leaving a headset session can temporarily lower the sense of presence in the actual world, a reflection of how immersion bends perception. For most people, that odd feeling resolves quickly. But for those already sensitive to dissociation, the adjustment can be harder, and the false-real boundary doesn't snap back right away. The same mimicked sensory distortions that make VR engaging are in vulnerable brains, the same ones that resemble derealization symptoms. This isn't speculation. Reviews have noted that heavy engagement with immersive digital environments, from social media to online gaming, correlates with more reports of dissociative complaints, especially in those already at risk. Importantly, this doesn't mean digital tools directly cause depersonalization derealization disorder. The current evidence is more cautious. Immersive use seems linked with higher likelihood of symptoms in susceptible people, not guaranteed outcomes in everyone. Still, the overlap is real enough that clinicians now ask about media habits when evaluating dissociation. Mechanisms can explain why. Our nervous systems expect sensory input at a regular pace, but fast, layered digital input overwhelms that rhythm. Imagine walking steadily down a path, then suddenly trying to balance on a moving ramp. Your balance doesn't fail, but it flickers. Digital platforms shift attention in that same jarring way. After hours of split-second updates and visual stimulation, the return to slow, unfiltered reality can feel oddly hollow, like a downgrade. That subtle mismatch is one seed of derealization. A second mechanism involves how the brain manages boundaries. Ordinarily, it keeps inner thoughts separate from the outer world, but screens blend the two. You think, you act, the environment responds instantly, whether through a social comment or a VR movement. Over time, that collapsing of inner and outer experience may dull the distinction. And that weaker boundary is exactly what depersonalization and derealization rely on, losing the sense of what is me versus what is out there. It's important to stress that this isn't weakness. Just as eyes strain in low light, attention and grounding strain under overstimulation. If you've ever felt hazy, unreal, or detached after a long night online, that doesn't mean you lack resilience. It means your brain reacted predictably to its environment. These moments aren't flaws, they're byproducts of systems working under stretches of strain. Generational trends highlight this more clearly. Young adults who grew up with constant connectivity report dissociation not just after trauma but after daily habits, binge streaming, juggling constant notifications, or gaming late into the night. For many, unreality isn't an occasional event, but part of the background of ordinary life. No single app or device is responsible. The issue is cumulative density, the brain toggling between immersive states, so often that ordinary perception loses some of its texture. Yet not everyone experiences it the same way. Vulnerabilities, stress levels, personality traits, sleep quality, other mental health conditions, all shape whether digital immersion simply feels tiring or tips into dissociation. That variability is why researchers view digital life as an amplifier rather than a cause. VR headsets, marathon gaming, or scrolling sprees won't push everyone into detachment. But they do heighten the chance for those already sensitive to it, and that's the key difference. Real-world accounts underline how fast this can happen. Some people describe a single late scroll session, paired with exhaustion, making the next morning feel dreamlike. The detachment isn't fleeting, it lingers into work or class, leaving basic routines scattered by a thin fog. These aren't edge cases. They're common enough that the statistical link between high digital use and dissociative symptoms fits the everyday reality many describe. At first, it may feel daunting. What can you do when the very tools most of us rely on encourage these shifts? But the encouraging takeaway is that the process is understandable and therefore manageable. If unreality arises after long immersion, it is the brain playing defense against too much stimulation. That predictability makes strategies clearer. Grounding exercises help. Here's a quick self-test. After a long night online, pause for 5 minutes. Run cool water over your hands. Name 5 things you can see, 5 you can hear, 5 you can feel. Notice whether the haziness eases. If it does, that's your nervous system resetting. The broader point is that identifying these patterns turns dissociation from a frightening mystery into a response you can map and anticipate. Recognizing digital immersion as a possible amplifier allows people not only to prepare relief strategies, but also to reinforce healthier boundaries around use. Change doesn't mean abandoning technology. It means pacing engagement, protecting downtime, and noticing signs early instead of wondering why reality starts tilting. And once you see that screens, feeds, and headsets can quietly prime the brain for detachment, another observation follows. Not all triggers are dramatic, and not every shift into unreality comes after obvious trauma. Some begin in small, everyday conditions that most of us overlook. Triggers hiding in plain sight. When people think about what sparks depersonalization or derealization, the images are usually of overwhelming moments, a major trauma, a sudden loss, or a life-threatening event. Those experiences can absolutely open the door to dissociation, but research makes it clear that they aren't the only catalysts. Episodes can appear in situations that look far more ordinary. The nervous system monitors stress at a level most of us don't consciously notice, and its threshold for pulling the disconnect lever doesn't always require catastrophe. The strongest and most consistent link in research is with trauma, particularly during childhood. Interpersonal trauma, especially emotional abuse or neglect, shows one of the clearest associations. Prevalence rates of depersonalization derealization disorder in groups with that history are dramatically higher, with studies reporting rates between 25% and 54%. That difference alone shows how early relational stress can calibrate the brain toward dissociation. Not every person with such history develops the disorder, but the numbers demonstrate that trauma isn't just one possible contributor. It's a powerful risk factor that sets sensitivity much lower. That said, a wide range of less dramatic situations can also act as triggers, often surprising those who experience them. What looks routine from the outside can load the nervous system past its capacity from the inside. The main categories tend to cluster around 4 areas: intense stress, sleep disruption, sensory overload, and substance use. Each can nudge the system into detachment, especially when someone already leans toward that response style. Stress is perhaps the most straightforward. It can take many forms: the aftermath of a heated argument, the build-up to a difficult exam, or cumulative pressure at work. The nervous system floods under tension, spikes in hormones like cortisol increase arousal, and while most people return to baseline afterwards, some don't. Instead of calm, their body flips into protective detachment, watching their own hands move without ownership, or staring at a room that suddenly looks drained of depth. Sleep is another powerful contributor. Even one night of poor rest, a work shift running too late, staying up to study, or simply losing track of time on a device can destabilize the pathways that keep perception, memory, and awareness integrated. Fatigue fogs the brain, and for some, that fog collapses into an episode where their sense of presence seems to fracture. What others mistake for just being tired is, for them, a vector into feeling estranged from themselves or the world around them. Overstimulation operates differently but lands in a similar place. Crowded trains, pulsing concerts, or the non-stop layering of notifications and obligations can shove the sensory system past its limit. Instead of drowning in noise, the nervous system abruptly dulls input. Suddenly, voices sound distant even when they're loud, or a street scene looks like a set flattened of dimension. It isn't a conscious choice. The system shifts gears to stop further strain. And then there are substances, with cannabis the one most often tied to episodes in clinical reports and anecdotal accounts alike. Cannabis alters time perception and intensifies bodily awareness, which for vulnerable people can be enough to trip the threshold into derealization or depersonalization. A session that feels mild for one user can unfold into a long detachment for another. Alcohol and other substances can also play a role, but cannabis comes up most consistently as a factor that can both precipitate and prolong episodes. In real life, these triggers don't stand alone. They often converge. A student juggling arguments at home, little sleep, heavy caffeine, and a glowing screen for hours might find that the simple act of sitting down for an exam suddenly pulls them into unreality. Another person binge streaming shows into the early morning stands up groggy, only to discover that their own voice feels mechanical and their bedroom curiously artificial. None of the ingredients seem extreme in isolation, but aligned together, they nudge the nervous system toward detachment. Driving long distances can illustrate the same principle. Monotony collides with vigilance. Long stretches of road demand attention but offer little novelty. Add sleep debt and stress, and some drivers describe flipping into an observer state, watching themselves steer while feeling oddly absent. Instead of absent-minded daydreaming, this is dissociation, the body carrying on while the sense of control thins. A useful way to think about these episodes is through sensitivity thresholds. Not everyone's nervous system has the same tipping point. For some individuals, it might take catastrophic trauma to flip into detachment. For others, smaller stresses accumulate and cross that threshold. Biology, past experiences, and current stress levels all shape where that line sits. Two people in the same classroom or same office may face identical pressures. One just feels drained, while the other stares as the scene tilts into dreamlike detachment. Neither response is a weakness, but rather a difference in calibration. Here's the key idea to hold on to. Small triggers can add up, sensitivity thresholds vary. For some people, minor stressors push the system into detachment. Understanding this opens practical doors. Once someone notices that stressful arguments, poor sleep, specific substances, or overstimulating environments tend to spark episodes, they gain a foothold. Researchers note that the simple act of tracking symptoms against daily conditions can help. Keeping a record, logging nights of little sleep, recording substance use, or noting when detachment follows heavy screen time, transforms the pattern from a mystery into a readable sequence. That knowledge doesn't prevent every episode, but it sharpens awareness of cause and effect. In turn, it reduces the sense that dissociation arrives out of nowhere, shifting it from random to somewhat predictable. That predictability also matters for reducing fear. Someone who knows that fatigue plays a role can remind themselves during an episode, "This is connected to my sleep," instead of spiraling into catastrophic interpretations. That reframe alone often lowers panic and makes space for grounding strategies. With practice, self-monitoring becomes the first line of management, just as people with panic or migraine learn to track their own triggers. Societal perception changes here too. Many believe dissociation always follows dramatic trauma, and while trauma is indeed one of the strongest risk factors, focusing only on it leaves those who detach in ordinary contexts feeling dismissed. Recognizing both the trauma pathway and the everyday triggers broadens understanding. It shows dissociation not as a binary, trauma or nothing, but as a spectrum of vulnerability where ordinary pressures can still strike heavily in some nervous systems. All of this leaves one more puzzle. If the brain can react this way even to minor stress, why does it sometimes choose to detach rather than switch on panic? Turning down reality seems like a strange protective choice, and yet the evidence suggests that is exactly what happens. To understand why, you have to look at how the brain weighs its options when stress rises. Why the brain picks disconnect instead of fight or flight. Faced with rising stress, the brain does not always surge into panic. Sometimes it takes the opposite path, numbing and disconnecting instead of unleashing fight or flight. To an outside observer, this can look calm or even composed, but inside the person feels strangely absent, cut off from the rush of emotion that usually signals urgency. This paradox, clarity without presence, alertness without grounding, sits at the heart of depersonalization and derealization. The well-known survival reaction floods the body with adrenaline, narrows vision, and primes muscles for action when danger is near. But in dissociative episodes, the experience flips. Instead of emotions exploding, they flatten. Instead of a heart racing with alarm, there can be an eerie sense of detachment. Neuroscience frames this not as random failure, but as a different tuning of the same circuitry. Specifically, it reflects frontal overregulation that inhibits limbic activity, producing emotional numbing, a pattern seen in neuroimaging studies of dissociation. Stress systems are layered rather than simple switches. In ordinary threats, like a car swerving too close in traffic, the amygdala and related limbic regions generate rapid fear, while the prefrontal cortex helps regulate and channel those impulses. Together, they produce the sharp urgency we call fight or flight. During dissociation, however, the balance alters. Prefrontal regions maintain high activity, suppressing limbic responses before emotions can flood the body. The result feels hollow, clear awareness of what's happening but stripped of resonance. You see the scene, but you don't feel it as yours. Why would the nervous system do this? The most plausible answer is overload prevention. When stress passes a threshold, a full panic could be destabilizing or even dangerous. Instead of allowing fear to peak, the system reduces emotional amplification. It is like lowering the volume before the speakers blow out. In doing so, you avoid drowning in distress, but lose the sense of connection that usually grounds experience. Movements seem robotic, voices sound unfamiliar, the world looks staged. Function remains, but presence erodes. This trade-off is costly. By blunting emotion, the brain shields against being overwhelmed, yet it also strips away reality's texture. Imagine being at a concert where the music grows unbearably loud. Covering your ears protects you from pain, but it also makes the sound flat and distant. Dissociation works the same way, a protective barrier that quiets sensation but distorts everything else. And sometimes, the barrier lingers even after the noise is gone. Evolution provides the context for this strategy. Fight or flight is not the only survival pattern. Animals also freeze or play dead under certain conditions. Numbing pain or disconnecting awareness helps prey animals endure capture or frightening restraint. Humans inherited those ancient responses, and dissociation is their psychological extension. It functions as an emergency brake, an option designed to keep the organism alive under extreme circumstances. The problem is that the brake can be pulled in moments that don't warrant it: arguments, fatigue, or everyday stresses. A system meant for extremes ends up firing in ordinary life. Importantly, this emergency brake does not mute everything. Many people say they can still think logically, sometimes even more sharply during an episode. They know what's happening, sometimes analyzing it in real time, but they cannot feel it. This striking mismatch, intact reasoning paired with absent emotional grounding, lines up with the imaging research. Executive control areas remain active, while the limbic system stays quiet. Persistence of that imbalance explains why the state can feel frozen, difficult to exit even when the trigger ends. Once engaged, the system can lock in, creating a self-maintaining loop. This sticking point matters because it helps explain chronicity. If the protective dampening system misfires too often, the nervous system learns it as a default pathway. Instead of releasing the brake, it keeps it pressed halfway down. Over time, dissociation becomes the go-to response even to moderate stress. Research notes that once this regulation pattern sets in, it is hard to reverse quickly. The same circuits that prevent overload stall their own reset, leaving the person caught between awareness and absence. Seeing dissociation through this lens changes how we interpret it. Instead of imagining something broken, it becomes the overuse of a tool meant for survival. Like anesthesia appropriate for surgery but extreme for a minor injury, numbing is helpful in rare emergencies but disrupts ordinary functioning when triggered repeatedly. The brain does not fail, it overprotects. And by overprotecting, it sacrifices the very qualities, connection, ownership, emotional resonance, that make experience feel genuinely lived. This explains the paradox many describe: fully present in one sense but completely absent in another. The body hears, sees, and moves, but the weight and immediacy of those signals are lost. It is as though reality continues at arm's length, visible but untouchable. Such accounts are not exaggerated. They echo what neurobiology confirms about mismatched brain activity. And here lies the most important reassurance. Dissociation is not evidence of psychosis, nor is it a sign of permanent brain damage. Research emphasizes that it is an adaptive response taken too far, not a collapse into madness. Panic often worsens disconnection, but understanding it as protective brakes overapplied can interrupt that spiral of fear. Recognizing that the brain is helping badly, rather than braking, helps many people endure episodes with less additional anxiety. So why does the brain sometimes choose disconnect instead of arousal? Because at certain points it decides that muting is safer than flooding. That choice avoids panic, but at the cost of grounding. When repeated, it becomes a habit, a safeguard overstaying its usefulness, tilting ordinary life into unreality. It is not a glitch so much as the overextension of a defense mechanism. Knowing this shifts the perspective. Instead of seeing dissociation as a permanent fracture, you can see it as a state that can be interrupted and eased. The protective reflex is strong, but not unchangeable. The fact that the brain can shift into disconnection means it can also shift back, if given the right cues. Next, we'll cover practical ways to interrupt this protective overreaction. Practical coping tools you can start using today. When unreality takes hold, it's easy to feel like there's nothing you can do until the state passes on its own. But research points to small, practical coping tools that can help soften episodes and shorten their duration. They don't erase depersonalization or derealization instantly, but they give you leverage, especially when used consistently. Reviews of clinical protocols note that grounding techniques, paced breathing, simple movement exercises, and external orientation strategies all have empirical support for reducing the intensity of dissociative symptoms. What matters most is learning a handful of reliable actions you can repeat when things feel unreal. The first tool is tactile grounding. When detachment creeps in, your mind feels foggy and untethered. Physical sensations can cut through that fog because they provide information the brain can't debate. Holding a cold object, pressing your feet firmly into the floor, or running your hands underwater anchors awareness with undeniable input. The nervous system receives a sharp, real-time signal that says this is happening right now, which interrupts spirals of unreality. A second reliable tool is paced breathing. During episodes, breathing often becomes shallow and automatic, which reinforces the sense of watching from a distance rather than living in the moment. A structured pattern such as inhaling through the nose for 4 seconds, holding briefly, then exhaling through the mouth for 7 or 8 seconds directly activates calming pathways. Clinical reviews show these techniques reduce arousal and increase regulation, making the body feel reconnected rather than detached. Even a short series of breaths can shift awareness back toward presence. Movement helps too, particularly when depersonalization makes your own body feel foreign. Small, deliberate actions, clenching and unclenching fists, stretching arms, even doing a few squats, reset the sense of agency. The body moves, the brain registers it, and the loop reinforces ownership. I did that. Over time, repeating intentional movements reclaims space from dissociation, proving to yourself that you're still participating in what happens, even while the episode runs in the background. The fourth tool is external orientation. When derealization makes the environment look staged or artificial, the natural instinct is to retreat inward and worry, which makes the distortion stronger. Instead, turn outward deliberately. A simple version is naming objects aloud. This is a desk, this is a cup, this is a clock. It's not about convincing yourself of reality logically. You already know the world hasn't vanished. It's about relinking perception with recognition. That act of naming pulls the brain's interpretive circuits back into gear, stitching sensory impressions together with meaning. Taken together, these strategies form a simple, repeatable sequence you can carry with you. A compact version could be: press both feet into the ground, hold something cold for 10 seconds, breathe in for 4 and out for 7, then name 3 things in the room. Practiced as a single flow, this routine gives the nervous system multiple prompts at once: tactile confirmation, physiological calming, motor feedback, and external orientation. Each stage tugs against detachment, and together they increase the chance of breaking its momentum. Consistency matters as much as the technique itself. Research emphasizes that practicing grounding and regulation outside of episodes strengthens the circuits you'll need later. It may feel odd to rehearse strategies when you already feel fine, but rehearsal makes them more automatic under stress. It works the way a fire drill works. By practicing in calm moments, the body knows what to do in emergencies without hesitation. Over time, this repetition increases resilience, making each future dissociative state easier to ease. Framing these tools as skills, not last-ditch rescues, changes their value. Each time you press your feet into the floor, regulate a round of breathing, clench your fists deliberately, or name objects around you, you demonstrate to the nervous system that presence can be re-established. The episode may not vanish, but its edges soften. Importantly, this reduces fear, and fear is often the fuel that magnifies dissociation. Regaining even partial control shifts the role from passive target to active participant. Daily habits can increase the effectiveness of coping strategies too. Simple self-care steps, regular sleep schedules, balanced nutrition, time away from screens, physical exercise provide a stronger baseline. Dissociation arises more easily when the body is under strain or running short on resources. A steadier baseline means fewer triggers stacking up, so episodes are less frequent and somewhat easier to contain. While lifestyle adjustments won't eliminate symptoms, they reduce the likelihood of the protective system overreacting. Flexibility also matters. Not every technique works the same for everyone. Some people feel immediate relief with sensory grounding but find paced breathing awkward, while others respond strongly to movement and dislike naming objects. The goal isn't to follow a rigid checklist, but to experiment, adapt, and keep the tools that resonate personally. The shared feature is that all these techniques signal safety to the nervous system. When safety is reinforced, detachment loses its grip. Even adopting one or two of these actions can shift how episodes unfold. Instead of drifting helplessly until they pass, you have anchors, sensory inputs, controlled breath, physical movement, external naming. Layering them builds strength, providing several entry points for regaining presence. The more consistently they are practiced, the more readily the body accesses them when dissociation strikes. Over time, this transforms the experience from uncontrollable fog into something with steps and structure. Recognizing these strategies as part of evidence-supported protocols makes them more than distractions. Grounding, paced breathing, and orientation cues are standard elements in therapeutic interventions for dissociation, and reviews show they reliably lessen the intensity of symptoms. They don't replace professional care, but they give practical tools you can use right now, combining immediate relief with long-term conditioning. And while these steps won't cure depersonalization or derealization outright, they provide a concrete sense of agency. You may not end every episode instantly, but you can shorten its reach, reclaim signals from your own body, and feel steadier in your environment. That shift from total helplessness to partial control is often the difference between spiraling fear and manageable discomfort. It creates space to continue with daily life rather than freezing inside unreality. Ultimately, coping tools work best as part of a broader approach. They handle the immediate intensity, but they build a foundation for the kinds of longer-term strategies people explore with professional guidance. The practical exercises here make episodes less overwhelming, giving you room to take the next steps without feeling engulfed. And that raises a larger question. If small daily techniques can offer relief, what options exist when you're looking for more structured forms of treatment backed by clinical research? Treatment approaches backed by science. For many years, people living with depersonalization or derealization disorder found that the treatment picture looked narrow and discouraging. Standard medications that worked well for depression, anxiety, or psychosis often failed to make more than a small dent. Antidepressants, antipsychotics, and mood stabilizers were tried, but in larger samples, they offered little relief beyond scattered partial improvements. This history created a tension. On the one hand, the condition was widespread and deeply distressing, but on the other, clinicians lacked targeted tools. Patients often walked away from therapy hearing that their symptoms were hard to treat, which left both sides frustrated. In recent years, however, the landscape has shifted. Researchers and clinicians increasingly view depersonalization derealization not as a condition that floats alone, but as part of broader stress and trauma responses. This shift has steered treatment toward psychotherapy as the mainstay, with adaptations designed specifically for dissociation rather than borrowed wholesale from other conditions. Cognitive behavioral therapy, for example, has been tailored so it goes beyond challenging distorted thinking. These variations target the feedback loop where fear of symptoms, "what if I'm losing my mind?" actually strengthens those same symptoms. Practical steps include teaching patients to recognize those fears, interrupt them, and respond with different behaviors, reducing the intensity and duration of episodes. Among currently available approaches, CBT-style interventions carry some of the strongest support, even though effectiveness can vary across individuals. Therapies oriented around trauma also play a central role. Since overwhelming stress is often at the root of dissociation, many clinicians emphasize the creation of safety, bodily presence, and calm within sessions. Instead of relying purely on analysis and conversation, therapists may help clients weave in grounding, movement, or structured relaxation during treatment itself. For people whose symptoms are linked with early interpersonal trauma, methods such as EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, or somatic therapies sometimes add an extra layer of benefit. While the evidence is still developing, preliminary studies suggest that these trauma-informed practices can be especially useful in cases where traditional talk therapy has limited impact. On top of psychotherapy, lifestyle adjustments often become a quiet but powerful foundation. Symptoms rarely vanish by improving sleep, nutrition, or exercise alone, but these habits raise the threshold before the nervous system tips into detachment. Sleep regularity is particularly critical. Episodes often flare after consecutive nights of poor rest. Exercise helps as well, not because it directly erases dissociation, but because it reduces stress hormones and strengthens pathways that support attention and bodily presence. Additions such as hydration, balanced nutrition, or limiting caffeine and alcohol provide stability that makes other interventions more effective. Without this baseline, more specialized treatments often fail to take hold. Medication does still have a role, though not usually as a treatment for dissociation itself. Clinical reviews show limited evidence for medications directly alleviating core symptoms. Instead, medications are often prescribed for comorbid issues like anxiety or depression. Since depersonalization often overlaps with both, this can help reduce the burden of secondary symptoms, making it easier to benefit from therapy. At the same time, researchers note that when dissociation is unrecognized in a broader clinical profile, patients may appear treatment-resistant. This underscores why accurate diagnosis and tailored care matter. Mislabeling symptoms as pure depression or panic disorder can lead to repeated trial and error with little success. Beyond these approaches, some labs have started investigating neurological interventions. Repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation, RTMS, and transcranial direct current stimulation, TDCS, rely on altering brain activity through targeted stimulation. Early pilot trials have shown promise, particularly when applied to regions thought to be under or overactive in dissociation, yet the evidence is not firm. Sample sizes in these studies are small, and benefits can fade outside of controlled trials. As reviews emphasize, some brain stimulation studies, RTMS-TDCS, have shown promising results in very small trials, but larger randomized trials are still needed. These methods remain experimental, worth watching, but not ready for widespread use. Another experimental approach is neurofeedback, in which participants use real-time displays of brain activity to try to retrain networks toward more stable patterns. For dissociation, the hope is that reinforcing stronger connectivity between self-perception regions might reduce symptoms. So far, results are preliminary and limited to small exploratory studies. It represents one of several attempts to design novel interventions aligned with dissociation's neurobiology, but like brain stimulation, it cannot yet be considered a reliable treatment. Looking across these options highlights an important conclusion. Psychotherapy remains the most established and practical starting point. Tailored CBT, trauma-informed therapies, and grounding strategies integrated with lifestyle habits currently hold the strongest combination of clinical support and accessibility. Medications typically target accompanying anxiety or depression, while experimental neurological approaches serve as future possibilities rather than current standards. That balance matters for patients weighing what to try first. The most realistic plan usually blends several strategies: core therapy, supportive habits, and adjunctive treatments for comorbid symptoms. When customized, this mix can significantly improve day-to-day functioning, shorten episodes, and reduce fear of symptoms. While complete remission is rare, progress is meaningful. More time spent grounded, less time lost to fog. Research confirms what people report anecdotally. Living with depersonalization or derealization can become far more manageable with the right supports in place. Just as important, momentum in awareness has made tailored care more available. Clinics that once overlooked dissociation are now beginning to address it directly. Therapy manuals include sections on managing depersonalization and derealization, and more therapists are trained in trauma-informed frameworks that make them sensitive to dissociative experiences. For someone seeking help, the key point is that not all clinicians are equally familiar with these symptoms, so seeking out professionals with direct experience, trauma-informed therapists, or clinics that specialize in dissociation can make a substantial difference. Clinician familiarity not only reduces misdiagnosis, but also increases the odds of treatment success. It is essential to keep expectations balanced. The science is improving, but there are still clear limits. Much of the evidence rests on small samples and short-term studies. For some people, benefits from brain stimulation or EMDR are striking but incomplete. For others, even careful therapy yields only gradual results. It is better to think in terms of progress and management rather than binary cure. Even partial symptom reduction can mean preserved work routines, more steady relationships, and less intrusive fear. That quality of life relief matters just as much as the disappearance of symptoms. The broader context is encouraging. What once felt like a neglected condition is increasingly recognized across research, clinical practice, and public conversation. The treatment map may still have large gaps, but it no longer leaves patients without direction. Focused psychotherapy, integrated with healthy routines and adjusted for comorbid challenges, provides a set of tools that work across many cases. Around those core strategies, emerging methods continue to push the field toward more precise answers. Taken together, the picture is one of cautious optimism. There is no single cure, but there are ways forward. Patients and clinicians have better tools than they did a generation ago, and more are being explored. That progress puts people in a stronger position to move beyond fear and find stability, even if complete remission remains rare. And with this growing knowledge comes a practical question many people still face. How do you know when what you're experiencing has crossed the line from passing stress into something that requires professional support? When to seek professional help? How can you tell when a stretch of detachment is something you can manage on your own, and when it's a sign that professional input is needed? That question often weighs heavily on people who experience depersonalization or derealization. After all, everyone loses focus sometimes, drifting through a few pages of a book without remembering what you read, driving across town and realizing you barely noticed the trip. Those moments are ordinary lapses. They vanish quickly, and life feels solid again. But when detachment lingers, when it cuts into daily functioning or sparks intense fear, that's when it moves beyond passing distraction into a clinical concern that deserves expert support. The difference begins with duration and control. In ordinary daydreaming, the lapse is shallow and ends quickly with little effort. You snap back as soon as a noise or your own shifting attention interrupts. With disorder-level depersonalization or derealization, the detachment can stretch for hours or longer, and it no longer feels like a choice. It feels imposed, as if reality itself has slipped out of your reach. That loss of control, combined with persistence, marks one of the clearer dividing lines between fleeting inattention and a disorder. Still, duration alone doesn't determine the threshold. The greater signal lies in impact. Clinical concern arises when the episodes start interfering with everyday functioning. That might mean being unable to focus on school assignments, stumbling through work steps you normally remember easily, or withdrawing from conversations because every interaction feels artificial. People in this state often report that they can't connect with loved ones, that memories don't feel anchored as their own, or that hours disappear in fog. These experiences create impairment at a level that doesn't resolve by willpower alone, which is where clinical involvement becomes necessary. Another key marker is distress. Normal zoning out may feel odd but rarely causes panic. Disorder-level dissociation, by contrast, often arrives with intense anxiety. Thoughts spiral: am I losing control? Will I ever feel real again? That fear feeds the episode, prolonging its grip. Beyond the unreality itself, it's the cycle of panic and detachment together that erodes daily life. When fear itself becomes debilitating, disrupting sleep, pushing people to avoid social contact, or driving constant self-monitoring, that is a point where professional help is strongly advised. Persistence adds further weight. A single hazy day after a sleepless night is inconvenient but rarely worrisome. Continuous or near-daily detachment lasting weeks points to a different trajectory, one that no longer resolves with rest or reduced stress. Clinicians watch for that timeline. If symptoms extend beyond a few weeks and continue to interfere with life, evaluation becomes a practical and responsible step. Prolonging help-seeking only adds strain. In fact, reviews highlight a striking finding. The average diagnostic delay for depersonalization derealization disorder is 7 to 12 years. That wait reflects how often symptoms are misunderstood or minimized, which means many people endure prolonged suffering unnecessarily. Seeking help earlier interrupts that pattern and creates more space for improvement. Relationships provide another signal. Detachment doesn't only affect the individual, it reaches outward. Friends and family may notice a person seeming distracted, emotionally flat, or disconnected. Some people withdraw not because they want distance, but because interactions themselves feel staged or hollow. This erosion of closeness is not typical of everyday stress. It is a symptom of depersonalization or derealization, and when it reaches this point, professional involvement is critical for protecting social connection as well as mental health. The role of professional help is not to instantly cure, but to give structure and perspective. One of the most significant shifts comes simply from having language for the experience. Many who first describe symptoms imagine that they are going crazy or developing psychosis. Clinicians can explain that dissociation is distinct from psychotic disorders, that it has specific patterns, and that effective coping strategies exist. This knowledge alone can reduce the extra layer of anxiety that worsens symptoms. Without it, people often spiral in silence, believing their condition to be rare, untreatable, or shameful. So how do you know when to move from self-monitoring to making an appointment? One clear method is to ask yourself a few grounding questions. Are the symptoms lasting beyond a few weeks with little sign of easing? Are they disrupting work, studies, or relationships in a way you cannot ignore? Do they trigger so much anxiety or panic that daily routines feel unsafe or impossible? Do you find yourself unable to ground or recover without help once an episode begins? If the answer to any of these is yes, it is time to consider an evaluation. This checklist gives you a practical set of indicators rather than leaving the threshold vague. Brief detachment that fades quickly, usually harmless. Weeks of repeated detachment, growing fear or disruption to basic functioning. That is a point where professional guidance can make a clear difference. Rather than taking it as a sign of failure, think of it as the same principle you would use for any health concern. If a symptom persists and affects daily life, it warrants skilled support. Importantly, people rarely regret seeking help early, but they often regret waiting. Early professional input shortens the cycle. It brings reassurance before panic patterns solidify. It introduces coping strategies before detachment becomes entrenched. And it gives space to adjust habits and environments to prevent triggers accumulating. Each of those factors can make the difference between living in cycles of fear for years and learning to manage symptoms in months. For those worried about what professional help actually involves, it can be reassuring to know it often begins simply. Assessments typically include conversations about how often episodes occur, how long they last, what triggers you've noticed, and how they affect day-to-day life. Treatments frequently start with education, coping strategies, and therapy sessions designed to build grounding skills, not invasive procedures or heavy medications. Knowing this reduces hesitation. The first step is usually a dialogue, not a drastic intervention. Recognizing where ordinary dissociation ends and disorder-level episodes begin is crucial. Our minds depend on occasional temporary detachment. It prevents overload in boring meetings or repetitive routines. But when that same mechanism starts hijacking days, undermining relationships, or carrying constant panic along with unreality, it's no longer benign. It's a signal that the nervous system is stretched beyond what self-management alone can handle. The bottom line is that depersonalization or derealization lasting more than a few weeks, interfering significantly with daily functioning, or causing intense distress is not something to ignore. Professional support is not a last resort. It's a practical step toward clarity, stability, and tools for regaining presence. And every year lost before seeking help prolongs the cycle unnecessarily, given what evidence now confirms about long delays in diagnosis and treatment. Knowing when to seek help reframes the question away from "is this serious enough?" and toward "is this interfering with my ability to live steadily?" That reframing relieves the pressure of guessing, turning it into an actionable choice. And once you cross that threshold, support becomes possible, from therapy plans and grounding techniques to reassurance that the condition is recognized, real, and manageable. This points to a deeper perspective. Once professional care is in place, the work isn't only about managing symptoms. It's also about shifting how you interpret them. If episodes of detachment feel terrifying because they seem like signs of losing your mind, fear will intensify them. But if they're understood as nervous system reactions, strange yet explainable, the experience changes. And it is at this level, where meaning and fear intersect, that the next step forward takes shape. Reframing the experience without fear. What if the strange disconnection you feel, your body seeming foreign, or the world looking dreamlike, weren't signs of going insane at all? What if they were signals that your nervous system has tipped past its comfort zone, leaning on a primitive protection reflex? This shift in perspective is what reframing offers. Instead of seeing depersonalization or derealization as proof of collapse, you can view them as clumsy safety mechanisms. That difference changes not only the emotional weight of an episode, but also how you respond in the moment. Fear is usually the first barrier against reframing. As soon as unreality sets in, panic races forward. Thoughts loop: what if I never return to normal? What if this means I'm broken? What if I'll always feel this way? Those catastrophic interpretations intensify stress, and stress strengthens dissociation. Instead of easing, detached states grow heavier. This is why clinical models describe dissociation as both a stress response and an anxiety feedback loop. Reframing interrupts this by lowering catastrophic interpretations. That, in turn, reduces the body's stress arousal, breaking the cycle that fuels symptoms. Understanding that pattern already gives back a measure of control. The sensations are not limitless freefalls. They are loops, predictable ones. A stressful overload triggers detachment. Fear of the detachment triggers more stress. The stress amplifies detachment further. Knowing that makes the experience less mysterious. And once symptoms are recognized as processes instead of terrors, a path toward management becomes visible. Normalization is pivotal here. The first time many people feel depersonalization or derealization, they have no name for it. The experience feels like a private failure, something so strange it must be rare. But epidemiology shows otherwise. Fleeting dissociation is common, and a clinical disorder affects about 1% of the population. Recognizing that your symptoms fit an established pattern shifts perspective from personal catastrophe to shared physiological response. Millions of others report the same sensations. That context stops isolation from magnifying fear. Knowledge adds another layer of relief. understanding why the brain detaches. Dissociation is the nervous system's version of a safety overreaction, much like sneezing when dust irritates your sinuses. You don't think you've lost your sanity when you sneeze. You recognize it as the body's reflex overshooting the need. Dissociation can be reframed the same way. It is the mind's reflex to protect against overload, activated to a degree that becomes disruptive. Naming it as protection gone overboard undercuts shame and strengthens self-compassion. With fear softened, tools regain value. Imagine experiencing unreality, but instead of spiraling into terror, you can label it. This is my nervous system protecting me. I've felt this before. I can step into my grounding routine. In that moment, exercises like paced breathing, sensory grounding, or oriented movement stop being desperate lunges at normality. They become cues guiding you back into presence. From the same sensations, two stories unfold: helplessness if viewed as proof of collapse, or steady re-anchoring if recognized as a protective reflex. Cognitive strategies make this practical. In CBT-informed protocols, reappraisal scripts are used during episodes. A simple, repeatable phrase can shift the nervous system. This is a protective response. I can use grounding now. This will pass. Saying it out loud or silently reminds you that the sensations are temporary, patterned, and survivable. Studies show that this kind of reframing reduces catastrophic thinking, which lowers anxious arousal and gently calms dissociation itself. Instead of fueling panic, your words become part of the intervention. Imagery also helps soften fear. Picture dissociation as a poorly trained security guard. At the hint of trouble, the guard rushes in, blocking access to emotion so you don't get overwhelmed. The guard means well but overreacts, forcing you back even when danger is minor. When you interpret episodes through this lens, your relationship to them changes. You stop treating them as betrayals of your mind and more as overzealous efforts at safety. You don't need to hate the guard, you need to guide them, steady them, and remind them when the alarm isn't real. That metaphor reduces the sense of internal conflict. The benefits become cumulative. Each episode handled without catastrophic fear weakens the loop between stress and detachment. Each successful use of a grounding cue proves to you that return is possible. Over time, unreality still appears, but terror no longer inflates it. Episodes go from overwhelming to inconvenient, from chaos to challenge. This trajectory doesn't remove symptoms instantly, but it changes their significance. They are no longer evidence of breakdown, they are signals of stress thresholds, and signals can be read, managed, and softened. Reframing provides a bridge not only within individuals, but also between individuals and communities. Talking openly about dissociation reduces stigma. When people hear that others have lived through the same sensations, the experience loses its alien strangeness. Social awareness creates scaffolding around symptoms. They stop being a secret abnormality and become part of the understood repertoire of human responses to stress. That cultural reframing helps individuals trust that their experiences belong within a wider map of psychology. The essential point is agency. Reframing breaks the chain where symptoms trigger fear, fear drives stress, and stress worsens symptoms. By softening catastrophic interpretations and naming dissociation as protection instead of destruction, you reinsert choice into the process. Self-talk, grounding, and normalization turn episodes into manageable events instead of existential crises. Clinical models highlight this shift as central. Lowering fear lowers stress, reducing the very physiological feedback that sustains dissociation. It's a cycle you can interrupt, not by force, but by understanding. When that reframing takes root, the emotional burden shifts dramatically. Each time unreality appears, you can remember, it's not a sign of collapse, only a nervous system stretched thin. That outlook holds no false promises of instant cure. It holds something more steady, a framework that lets you live alongside the sensations without panic. And from that steadiness, healing practices and external support have more room to work. In the end, the takeaway is clear. You didn't break. Your nervous system is trying to keep you safe. Learning to calm it gives you back agency. And seeing that changes how you approach what comes next. What seems like a flaw in perception is better understood as a protective reflex turned up too high. Depersonalization and derealization are not sabotage, but the nervous system's way of pulling an emergency brake under stress. The good news is clear. Practical tools and professional support can lessen the intensity and disruption. And seeking help earlier matters, because waiting years, something many people unfortunately do, only prolongs suffering. If you've ever had brief flashes of unreality, share your experience in the comments and let us know which grounding tool you'd try first. Subscribe for more clear, practical mental health explanations. You can treat these moments as signals and learn to come back, and many people do.